Imagine, for a second, finding out that the legend of King Arthur pulling the sword from the stone. You know, that classic story.
Right, the boy and the magic sword.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine finding out that it wasn't a story about magic or divine right at all.
Oh, wow.
But that it was actually this highly complex, completely codified legal document, like a medieval constitution outlining land taxation.
That is, I mean, that would completely change everything.
Right. You thought you were reading this fun myth, but you were actually reading foundational economics.
Yeah.
And that is the exact scale of the historical bombshell we are looking at today in this deep dive.
It really is.
Because we look back at these foundational narratives of ancient civilizations, and we just assume we understand the text. We assume the words mean exactly what we've been told they mean for centuries.
Which is, frankly, incredibly dangerous,
Yeah.
especially when we're dealing with language that has been translated and retranslated and interpreted and heavily politicized over thousands of years.
Right. We assume linguistic stasis, like the words just sat there unchanged.
Exactly. We assume stasis when the reality is that language is incredibly dynamic. And sometimes the original structural integrity of a text is just entirely lost to history.
Which brings us perfectly to the mission for today's deep dive. So if you're listening, strap in, because we are exploring a profoundly paradigm-shifting body of work by Dr. Khaled Waleed.
It's a fascinating journey.
It really is. He is taking us into linguistic archaeology and ancient economics. We're going to look at how history might have completely misunderstood a massive, famous historical narrative.
Yeah, and according to Dr. Waleed, this ancient story about a literal biological camel coming out of a solid rock is, well, he argues it's actually a sophisticated blueprint for a complex economic taxation and welfare system.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is, but Dr. Waleed builds this really meticulous step-by-step case for it. And to understand his argument, we kind of have to establish the premise he operates from first.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So he posits that for centuries, traditional interpretations of these ancient Arabic texts have engaged in what he calls a deliberate ignorance methodology.
A deliberate ignorance methodology.
Right.
That's a highly specific accusation, right?
Yeah.
Because deliberate implies intent.
It does. It absolutely does. Dr. Waleed argues that this wasn't merely an accident of time or passive linguistic drift. He suggests there was a systemic, even malicious effort.
Malicious.
Yeah, he actually characterizes the inspiration as demonic in the theological sense of the text. Right? An effort to take these distinct, highly specific, almost mathematical terms from the Quran and intentionally flatten them into broad synonyms.
Just to obscure their true meaning.
Exactly, to obscure their true economic and political demands.
Okay, I have to push back on that a little bit. On the idea of a malicious, coordinated conspiracy spanning centuries,
Yeah.
is it really necessary to attribute this to demonic or deliberate malicious inspiration? Like, couldn't this simply be the natural result of linguistic drift over 1,000 years?
It's a fair question.
Because if you think about the massive sociolinguistic shifts, right? The early Islamic empire moved from this agrarian, tribal, desert society to massive, centralized urban centers, like Damascus and Baghdad.
Right, huge metropolitan areas.
Yeah, so you lose the context of the desert and the agrarian terminology, and suddenly people are just kind of guessing at what ancient words mean.
Yeah.
It's like translating a nuanced legal contract using Google Translate today.
That's a great analogy, actually.
You get the literal words, but you lose the binding legal architecture entirely.
Yeah, and that is a very fair sociolinguistic counter-argument. And it's how many secular linguists would view the phenomenon, to be clear.
Right.
However, to fully engage with Dr. Waleed's thesis, we really have to look at the text through his proposed framework. We are just presenting his ideas here.
Of course. Let's get into his framework.
So Dr. Waleed insists that the internal evidence of the text points toward a deliberate suppression. Why? Because the economic implications of the true translation were violently opposed to the interests of the ruling elites of subsequent dynasties.
Oh, I see. Follow the money.
Always. If the text mandated massive wealth redistribution, well, the elite had a massive vested interest in redefining that text as a harmless historical fable.
That makes a lot of sense. So to understand this massive, society-altering shift in perspective, Dr. Waleed says we first have to unbraid a very specific, tangled linguistic knot.
We do. He identifies 3 distinct words that he claims have been disastrously mashed together by history.
And those words are Jamal, Ebal, and naka.
Right. This is the absolute foundation of Dr. Waleed's linguistic deconstruction. The traditional commentaries have essentially equated these three distinct Arabic words to all simply mean camel.
Like just variations of the same animal.
Yeah, exactly. A male camel, a general camel, a female camel. Just camels. But Dr. Waleed strictly delineates them. He argues that blending these terms completely destroys the intricate data structure of the text.
Okay.
And his very first target is the word Jamal. According to Dr. Waleed, Jamal absolutely does not mean the animal we know as the ship of the desert.
Okay, so if Jamal isn't the camel, what is he proposing it actually means, based on morphology?
Dr. Waleed states that Jamal actually means a thick, heavy rope.
A rope?
A rope. Specifically, he identifies it as the kind of massive braided maritime rope used to tie large marine ships to the docks in a port.
Okay, a maritime docking rope. My immediate question there, just geographically speaking, if we are talking about an ancient text originating in the Arabian Peninsula, which is heavily associated with desert environments,
right?
Why would they use a highly specific maritime term? It seems out of place.
It does seem that way, but it's a common misconception that ancient Arabia was purely this isolated desert. Dr. Waleed points out that they were deeply embedded in massive intercontinental trade networks.
Oh, true. The spice routes and all that.
Exactly. The coastal regions of the Arabian Peninsula, places like Yemen and the Hejaz, were critical maritime hubs connecting the Roman Empire, India, and East Africa.
So they weren't just riding camels. They were managing massive shipping ports.
Precisely. The populations interacting with this text were acutely aware of maritime technology. And to prove his definition of Jamal as a rope, Dr. Waleed points to a very famous verse, one that actually has parallels in Christian texts as well.
The needle one.
Yes. It states that those who arrogantly reject the divine signs will not enter paradise until a Jamal passes through the eye of a needle.
The classic imagery of the camel passing through the eye of a needle. You know, I've always found that metaphor slightly clumsy.
How so?
Well, it conveys impossibility, sure. But why a camel? Why not an elephant or a mountain or a house? It just lacks a certain literary cohesion to contrast a sewing tool with a random mammal.
That is precisely Dr. Waleed's argument. He asks us to really look at the structural and literary logic of the metaphor.
Right.
If you use the traditional translation of a biological camel, you are contrasting a small metal hole intended for a thread with a large, fleshy, living mammal.
Which is random.
It demonstrates impossibility, yes, but it completely lacks literary symmetry. But, and here's the genius of it, if we apply Dr. Waleed's definition of Jamal as a thick maritime rope, the metaphor locks into perfect, brilliant symmetry.
Oh, I see it. Because you're contrasting a tiny, thin thread, which is what's actually supposed to go through the eye of a sewing needle,
right,
with a massive, impossibly thick thread, which is essentially what a braided maritime rope is.
Exactly.
It's a contrast of scale within the exact same functional category.
Yeah.
A tiny thread versus a super thread. That's so much better.
It really is. Dr. Waleed argues that this interpretation of Jamal as a thick rope makes vastly more structural sense. It restores the semantic precision of the text.
And what about the root word itself?
Right. So the root letters of Jamal, in Arabic jim, mim, lam, relate to gathering, collecting, or bringing things together into a whole.
Okay.
And a thick maritime rope is literally hundreds of smaller threads and fibers gathered and bound together to create immense tensile strength.
That morphological connection makes perfect sense. The root means to gather and bind, which is literally the definition of a rope.
Exactly.
But, okay, if Jamal is the rope, a desert-dwelling mercantile society still needs a word for their most important physical asset. I mean, the text cannot possibly ignore the actual animal that powered their entire civilization.
Right, they definitely had camels.
So what are they calling the biological camel?
This leads us directly to the second term Dr. Waleed defines. According to his research, the actual biological animal, that marvel of natural adaptation, is specifically referred to in the text as Ebul.
Ebul?
Yes. It is not Jamal, and it is not Naka.
So Ebul is the camel?
Yes. And Dr. Waleed points to a specific verse to demonstrate this. It asks, do they not look at the Ebul how they are created?
Okay, so it's pointing to the creation of it.
Right. He notes that in this instance, the text is drawing explicit attention to the biological, scientific, and anatomical creation of the animal. It's asking the reader to observe how the creature is perfectly engineered to survive the harshest climatic conditions on Earth. The focus is entirely on physical biology.
Which tracks perfectly, because if a text is going to tell people to marvel at biological engineering, it will use the precise noun for the biological creature, not a metaphorical or economic term.
Exactly. And to further solidify this, Dr. Waleed analyzes how the text categorizes livestock, using a broader taxonomic term called ANM.
ANM. Okay.
He points out that this category explicitly lists sheep, goats, cows, and the ibl.
So it functions as a strict agricultural taxonomy. You have your grazing flocks, your bovine herds, and your desert transport animals, the ibl.
Precisely. The precision of the language is absolutely paramount for Dr. Waleed here.
Yeah, you can't just mix them up.
Right. He argues that when traditionalists, through this deliberate ignorance methodology, blend Jamal rope, ibl the biological animal, and Naka into one homogenized bucket labeled camel, they are actively destroying the text's internal logic.
Okay, I see where he's going with this. By establishing that Jamal means rope and ibl means camel, he is clearing the board.
He is.
He's proving that the text uses highly specific vocabulary, which means we cannot just assume the third word, Naka, is merely a synonym for a female camel.
Exactly.
He's setting up the premise that Naka must have its own unique, highly specialized definition.
That is the exact trajectory of his argument. Dr. Waleed suggests that the primary motive behind conflating all these terms was specifically to hide the true meaning of the Naka.
To hide it?
Yeah. By convincing the masses that the Naka was just another word for a biological camel, history successfully hid a profound divine financial and economic institution behind a literal story about livestock.
That is wild. But before we get to what the Naka actually is, Dr. Waleed requires us to completely reevaluate the verbs associated with it, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
Specifically the verbs for eating and drinking, because if the Naka isn't an animal, then how can a text talk about it eating and drinking?
Right, that's the big hurdle. This is where Dr. Waleed outlines a complex, three-tiered conceptual framework for the word eating, which in Arabic is akal.
Uncle, okay.
He argues that we have to stop assuming that every time an ancient text mentions eating, it refers to mastication and swallowing.
So what is his three-tiered framework?
Dr. Waleed divides consumption into three categories based on what is doing the consuming.
Okay.
The first tier is the body. This is the literal biological meaning. Physical food consumed for strength, building muscle, extending life, and cellular healing.
Right, the fundamental biological necessity. We all got to eat.
Exactly. But the second tier involves the soul, or the nafs.
The nafs.
When the text speaks of the soul eating, Dr. Waleed explains it refers to the psychological desire for material acquisition.
Sounds like hoarding.
Yes. It involves hoarding wealth, accumulating property, gathering resources. He notes it is driven by a deep-seated anxiety and the illusion that gathering massive amounts of material wealth will somehow grant a form of earthly immortality or ultimate security.
That's fascinating. It's psychological consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Consuming resources to feed the ego and alleviate existential dread.
That's a great way to put it. Now, the third tier is the spirit, or the ruh.
Okay, the ruh.
When the spirit eats, Dr. Waleed defines this as intellectual or spiritual consumption.
Like learning.
Exactly. It is the gathering of knowledge, the elevation of the mind, the pursuit of wisdom, and striving toward higher states of consciousness.
So we have body, soul, and spirit. Physical food, material wealth, and intellectual knowledge. All three entities are capable of consumption in their respective domains.
Precisely. And Dr. Waleed applies this specifically to the economic passages of the text. In an economic and sociological context, eating, or akal, means the consolidation, accumulation, and quantitative growth of assets.
Okay.
And similarly, drinking, which is shurb, is not an animal lapping up water from a trough.
What is it then?
In an agrarian society, drinking refers to the intake of resources required to grow, which specifically means agricultural irrigation.
You know, we actually use this exact linguistic framework today, particularly in finance and economics.
We do? How so?
Yeah, we constantly use consumption metaphors. Think about it. We say a megacorporation gobbled up 3 smaller startups.
Oh, right.
Or we say inflation ate into our profit margins. Or we talk about a company burning through its liquid capital. And by the way, the use of the word liquid for finances is literally a water metaphor.
That is so true. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, when we say these things, nobody thinks a CEO is physically chewing on a smaller company.
All right, no one pictures that.
We are talking about wealth accumulation, resource distribution, and asset consolidation. So Dr. Waleed is basically arguing that the ancient text is utilizing high-level economic metaphors that are entirely consistent with advanced financial vocabulary.
That is exactly his argument. When you understand that eating means accumulating material yield and drinking means agricultural irrigation, the entire narrative of the Naka unlocks.
Okay, I'm ready.
With this economic vocabulary established by Dr. Waleed, we can finally look at his radical reinterpretation of the story of the Prophet Salih and the people of Thamud.
All right, let's contextualize the traditional story first, just so everyone is on the same page.
Sure.
The standard narrative is that the Prophet Salih was sent to this incredibly wealthy, powerful civilization called Thamud. They demanded a miracle to prove his prophethood, so he brought a giant, pregnant female camel, the Naka, out of a solid rock.
Right, the classic miracle.
Yeah, and he told them to let her eat and drink freely, but the people of Thamud eventually killed her, and as a result, a divine punishment destroyed their entire civilization.
Yes, that is the literal biological interpretation that Dr. Waleed argues is a pure product of the ignorance methodology. Dr. Waleed states unequivocally that the Naka of Thamud was not a female camel.
So the big reveal, if it wasn't an animal, what was it?
According to Dr. Waleed, the Naka was a material, highly visible economic institution.
An institution?
Yes. It was an agricultural land endowment. In Islamic legal terms, it operates similarly to a waqf, which is a public trust or a taxation system known as kharaj.
Okay, a public trust.
And Dr. Waleed asserts it was specifically designed by divine decree to eradicate systemic poverty, a condition known as faqr.
Faqr. So the Naka was an endowment meant to cure the faqr.
Yeah.
The public trust was meant to eradicate the poverty.
Exactly. Dr. Waleed details the specific mechanics of what he calls the pact of the Naka.
How does that pact work?
Well, if we look at the commands given to the people of Thamud through this new economic lens, it changes completely. Salih tells the elite of Thamud, leave her to eat in Allah's land.
Okay.
Now, if the Naka is a land endowment, Dr. Waleed explains that eating in Allah's land means allowing this public, sacredly protected land to accumulate quantitative agricultural yield.
So allowing the land to produce.
Yes. It means permitting the crops to grow, cultivating the land, and gathering the harvest specifically for the public treasury.
So you allow the public fund to eat. You allow the endowment to accumulate wealth through agrarian production. That makes total sense with the metaphors we discussed.
It does. Then we have the command regarding water. Salih says she has a share of water and you have a share of water on an appointed day.
Okay, so the drinking part.
Right. Dr. Waleed argues this refers strictly to irrigation rights, which were the absolute lifeblood of any ancient agrarian economy.
Because water is the ultimate currency.
Exactly. The wealth of the land was mandated to be divided. The private citizens of Thamud had their allocated share of the irrigation water for their massive private estates.
Right.
But they were legally and divinely obligated to allow a specific share of water to irrigate the public welfare fund, the Naka.
Wow. Dr. Waleed is essentially describing a progressive taxation system integrated with a public land trust. It's a literal mechanism for structural wealth redistribution.
He is. And this framing brings us to what Dr. Waleed calls the fitna, or the test.
The test, because ancient narratives frequently revolve around a test of character or faith. But how does an economic institution serve as a test?
Well, Dr. Waleed argues that the true test for the powerful, arrogant elite of Thamud had absolutely nothing to do with animal cruelty.
It wasn't about being nice to a camel.
No, not at all. The test was profoundly socioeconomic. It was a test of their willingness to redistribute their wealth and yield their monopoly on resources.
The hardest test of all for the ultra-wealthy.
Exactly. Would they give up a portion of their precious irrigation water to fund the public treasury? Would they allow the destitute to have a share of the gross domestic product?
And based on the traditional descriptions of Thamud, they were an incredibly opulent society, right?
Oh, incredibly. They literally carved mansions into mountains.
Yeah, they represented the extreme concentration of wealth. So the Naka, in Dr. Waleed's framework, was a divine mandate forcing them to institutionalize charity.
Yes.
It wasn't just asking them to give alms when they felt generous. It was imposing a rigid structural division of resources that challenged their absolute economic dominance.
That is the exact dynamic Dr. Waleed paints. The people of Thamud, specifically the ruling elite, looked at this public endowment, this Naka, and they despised it.
Of course they did.
They resented their water being diverted to public land. They actively resisted the structural redistribution of wealth.
Which leads us to their rebellion. They decided to commit tax evasion and economic sabotage on a massive societal scale.
Yes, they did.
And this brings us to the infamous Act of the Ochre, which is traditionally translated as hamstringing.
Right. In the traditional biological translation, akr means to physically hamstring an animal, slicing the tendons in its legs so it collapses prior to slaughtering it.
But if the naka isn't an animal, they couldn't exactly hamstring it. You can't hamstring a public trust.
Right.
So how does Dr. Waleed redefine akr?
Dr. Waleed entirely redefines akr based on a deep analysis of its Arabic morphological roots.
Okay, linguistics again.
Right. He argues it absolutely does not mean slaughtering with a knife. The root of akr relates intimately to the concept of a barren woman.
A barren woman.
Yes, a woman whose reproductive system cannot produce children. The fundamental meaning of the root is to cut off, to disable, or to prevent growth and generation.
To make something barren. To sever its generative capacity.
Exactly.
I can actually see the linguistic branching there. Because slicing an animal's tendon severs its mobility, and making a womb barren severs its generative capacity.
Right. It's about severing a core function.
So how does one apply the concept of akr to an economic institution like a land endowment?
By committing akr against the naka, Dr. Waleed argues the people of Thamud enacted a devastating economic embargo.
An embargo.
They severed the generative capacity of the public trust. They cut off the irrigation. They blatantly refused to give the naka its mandated share of the water.
Wow. They literally cut off the life support of the welfare system.
They did. They annexed the public endowment land back into their own private estates. They effectively prevented the kharaj, the tax yield, from growing, producing, and reaching the destitute populations.
They intentionally made the public welfare system barren.
Exactly. They made it barren.
Dr. Waleed has a specific phrase that summarizes this causal relationship, doesn't he?
He does, and it's a brilliant distillation of his thesis. Acquire leads to faqr.
Cutting the endowment leads directly to poverty.
Yes. By enacting this embargo, the elite of Thamud systematically forced the vulnerable populations into starvation and destitution.
And Dr. Waleed also points out a fascinating psychological element to this decision, right? Because this wasn't merely a clinical administrative budget cut.
No, not at all.
It was driven by a highly specific sociological pathology. He highlights the role of the companion they called upon to execute this accord.
Right. The text states that the elite of Thamud called their companion and he took it and hamstrung the naka.
Okay, so who is the companion?
Dr. Waleed identifies his companion not as a literal assassin with a sword, but as the whispered temptations of Iblis, the embodiment of greed and demonic inspiration within the text's theology.
Ah, so it's internal.
Yes, it represents the psychological rationalization of extreme selfishness. The elite convinced themselves that they were entitled to hoard the water and the wealth, justifying the starvation of the lower classes just to maintain their opulent lifestyle.
It's the ancient rationalization of the oligarch, right? Why should we give our hard-earned water to these poor people? We built the infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's our land.
Exactly, we earned it.
But this brings up a massive logical inconsistency in the traditional translation that Dr. Waleed's theory seems to solve entirely.
Oh, about the timeline.
Yes. If I am reading a story about slaughtering a biological animal, it is a singular one-and-done event.
Right.
You kill the camel, it is dead, the crime is complete, and the story moves to the consequences. But Dr. Wall notes from the text that they actually committed this arcware multiple times over a period of time.
Yes, they did.
You cannot kill a camel multiple times. It's impossible.
This is a crucial, undeniable piece of textual evidence for Dr. Waleed. The text indicates a chronology of events and repeated actions that makes zero sense if the subject is a biological animal.
Right, but it makes perfect sense if the subject is an economic institution. Like you said, you can only slaughter an animal once, but you can continuously defund a public program over consecutive fiscal periods.
You can cut the budget year after year. You can systematically tighten the embargo until the program is completely dead.
Exactly. And this chronological reading brings us to the escalating consequences that Thamud faced. What Dr. Waleed details as the anatomy of their ruin.
The anatomy of their ruin. I like that.
He traces the timeline of the divine punishment very carefully to show it was a process, not just a singular lightning bolt from the sky.
Okay, walk us through Dr. Waleed's timeline of their collapse.
According to Dr. Waleed, the first action was the exire. They defunded the endowment and cut the water.
The embargo.
Right.
Okay.
In immediate response to this economic sabotage, they were hit by the Rajfa.
The Rajfa. Now, that is traditionally translated as an earthquake or a physical tremor, isn't it? Yes, a literal shaking of the earth. But Dr. Waleed interprets this Rajfa within the economic context. He views it as an initial economic or social destabilization.
Like a shockwave.
Exactly. It was a profound psychological and material shock to their system. Think of it as a severe market crash, a localized depression, widespread civil unrest, or a major societal tremor resulting from the sudden lack of public funds.
So it wasn't a tectonic earthquake, it was an economic earthquake.
Right. It was a severe warning shot across the bow of their civilization.
It was the immediate cause and effect of tampering with the economic balance. You starve the public trust, and the economy shakes.
That's it, exactly.
But the critical detail here is that the society didn't end there, did it?
No, precisely. They didn't die from their rajfa. The society survived the initial shock. Furthermore, Salih, the prophet, remained among them and continued to negotiate, continued to warn them.
Which is the definitive proof that the Nazca wasn't a dead animal.
Right.
Because if the camel is dead, negotiations are over. The crime is permanent and irreversible. You don't negotiate about a dead camel.
Dr. Waleed points out that because the Naka was a structural economic system, it was merely halted, frozen, or made barren by the embargo. It wasn't physically erased from existence.
The land was still there.
Exactly. The land was still geographically there. The water sources were still flowing. The system could easily have been restored. They simply needed to reverse the embargo and open the irrigation channels back to the public land.
So they were actively given a chance to bail out the public fund and save their society.
They were. They were granted a specific grace period. The text explicitly states they were given 3 days of enjoyment in their homes.
3 days.
Right. Dr. Waleed interprets this as 3 specific periods of time, perhaps fiscal cycles or harvests, to reflect on the damage caused by the Rajfa, to reverse their greedy course, and to reinstitute the Naka.
But they refused to yield.
They completely refused. They persisted in their extreme hoarding. They repeated the Ak, entrenching their embargo and ensuring the public trust remained entirely barren.
They doubled down on the greed.
They did. And when they persisted in this absolute economic tyranny, pushing the wealth disparity to its absolute limit, the ultimate collapse occurred. They were hit by the Seha.
The Seha.
Okay.
Which is traditionally translated as the blast or the deafening shout.
Yes. And the Seha utterly destroyed them. Dr. Waleed describes this ultimate punishment as a total systemic collapse.
The collapse of everything.
Everything. They were crushed by immense psychological pressure, societal violence, and economic ruin to the point of wishing for death. The text says they were found flattened in their homes.
Wow.
The infrastructure of their elite existence literally collapsed on top of them.
You know, when you look at how Dr. Waleed describes the people of Thamud, he explicitly focuses on the text, calling them arrogant, extravagant, and the elite class who corrupt the earth and do not reform it.
Yes, those are the exact descriptors.
This interpretation transforms the narrative from an ancient history lesson about a localized miracle into a terrifyingly relevant sociological warning.
It really is terrifyingly relevant.
It argues that hoarding resources, engineering massive wealth disparity, and systematically defunding the vulnerable creates an unsustainable societal pressure cooker.
Exactly.
Eventually, the foundation gives out, and the entire superstructure of the civilization collapses.
It perfectly models the very real societal collapse that occurs when inequality reaches a mathematical breaking point.
Right.
When a civilization systematically dismantles its commitment to its most vulnerable populations, it destroys its own foundation. Dr. Waleed is arguing that the divine law outlined in the text isn't just abstractly spiritual, it's practically and mathematically economic.
You can't cheat the math.
No, you cannot sustain a civilization on extreme, unchecked greed. The collapse is an inevitable equation.
So systemic poverty, in Dr. Waleed's reading, isn't an accident or a glitch in the system.
Not at all.
It is the direct, manufactured result of the Abiachkwai, the deliberate, calculated choices made by the powerful elite to cut off the flow of resources to the public.
Perfectly stated.
So, to summarize Dr. Waleed's overarching thesis, we need to bring in his final and perhaps most compelling piece of textual evidence regarding the exact mathematical percentage of this required wealth distribution.
Yes, this brings everything together. Dr. Waleed ties his entire thesis of the Naka to another distinct legal concept within the text, the rule of the Kums.
The Kums, which translates to the 1/5.
Yes, the Kums. It is a strict mandate that a 1/5 portion, or 20%, of all gathered wealth or surplus production belongs to Allah, the messenger, the relatives, the orphans, the needy, and the traveler.
A flat 20%.
Exactly. It is a rigid, non-negotiable slice of the societal pie perpetually dedicated to public welfare and the vulnerable.
Let's examine Dr. Waleed's mizan, his balance chart, because this synthesizes his entire argument beautifully.
It really is a great summary tool.
He constructs a table contrasting the illusion of the traditional translation with the reality of his linguistic interpretation.
Let's walk through the mizan. So in the column of illusion, generated by the ignorance methodology, the Naka is a female biological camel.
Right.
But in Dr. Waleed's column reality, the Naka is an endowment land and a structural tax system.
In the illusion column, Aka is the physical act of butchering an animal with a knife.
Yes.
But in Dr. Waleed's reality, Aka is halting financial rights, enforcing an economic embargo, and preventing public economic growth.
Exactly. And in the illusion, eating and drinking means an animal grazing on desert scrub and lapping up water.
Right.
While in the reality, it means agrarian production accumulation and irrigation shares strictly allocated for the public treasury.
So Dr. Waleed is effectively concluding that the Naka, the physical manifestation of the comes for the people of Thamud.
Yes, that is his conclusion.
It is that exact 20% mandatory slice meant for the vulnerable. And he is arguing that history, through linguistic drift, sociopolitical shifts, and potentially deliberate obfuscation by later empires, took a rigorous, mathematically precise financial constitution and reduced it into a harmless, literal myth about a thirsty camel.
It is a stunning, comprehensive recontextualization. I mean, according to Dr. Waleed, the true crime of Thamud had absolutely nothing to do with animal cruelty.
Not a thing.
It was systemic, institutionalized economic oppression. They denied the basic, divinely mandated right of economic sustenance to the poor.
They starved their own people.
They did. They looked at the Naka, the structural system, explicitly designed to eradicate poverty, and they actively dismantled it out of pure, unadulterated greed.
Wow.
And for that refusal to share the water of life with the marginalized, their civilization was subjected to absolute irreversible collapse.
It entirely reframed how we must interact with these texts. I mean, we started this deep dive talking about how we assume we understand the ancient mechanics of these stories.
We do assume that.
But Dr. Khaled Waleed has laid out a compelling case that demands we unlearn centuries of assumptions. He has demonstrated how an entire economic paradigm, a highly structured mandate for social equity, was effectively buried under literal translations and morphological misunderstandings.
It really shows how fragile meaning can be.
It demonstrates how easily the true mechanisms of societal welfare and structural taxation can be neutralized if you simply change the definitions of the foundational words over time.
Exactly. Dr. Waleed's work demands that we look past surface-level myths. It requires the reader to engage in rigorous linguistic archaeology, to critically question the accepted historical narratives, and to search for the complex socioeconomic engineering operating beneath the surface of the text.
We can't just take the translation for granted.
No, we can't. Because if we fail to recognize the true nature of the text demands, we might be guilty of perpetuating the very same ignorance that Dr. Waleed argues doomed the civilization of Thamud.
It's a profound thought that forces us to reevaluate our relationship with history. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, our listener, with one final provocative question to ponder on your own.
What's a big one?
It is. If Dr. Waleed's methodological approach is accurate, if the slow march of linguistic drift, the loss of context, and the passage of thousands of years can turn a highly sophisticated economic welfare system into a literal children's story about a camel emerging from a rock.
Right.
What other ancient myths, fables, or religious parables that we take completely literally today are actually hiding lost, brilliant blueprints for how to build a better society?
It boggles the mind.
Think about that the next time you read an ancient story. The blueprint for a lost civilization might be hiding right there, embedded in the vocabulary, hiding in plain sight.